It's very much our treat to have the interview guest that we have today. This is part of our continuing series where we talk to people on the left, on the right, reporters, professors, activists, anybody we can. We want to get their opinion unfettered and unedited directly to you so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it will come back, maybe it won't. Perhaps a lost renaissance. With us today, it's our privilege to have ILYA SOMIN. I hope I'm saying that correctly. SOMIN. ILYA SOMIN, Professor ILYA SOMIN at the George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School. He's a professor of law there. He's also the chair in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute. Yes, that Cato Institute. His research focuses on constitutional law, property law, democratic theory, federalism, and migration rights. He's the author of Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom by Oxford University Press, Democracy and Political Ignorance by Stanford University Press, The Grasping Hand, Kilu versus City of New London by University of Chicago Press, and A Conspiracy Against Obamacare, The Volkow Conspiracy, and the Health Care Case. I've heard of that. Eminent Domain and Comparative Perspective by Cambridge University. So all the big top publishing university firms. His work has appeared in numerous scholarly journals, including the Yale Law Journal, Stanford Law Review, Northwestern University Law Review, Georgetown Law Review, Critical View, and others. SOMIN has also published articles in a variety of popular press outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, CNN, NBC, The Atlantic, USA Today, Boston Globe, US News, World Report, South China Morning Post, interesting, National Law Journal, and Reason magazine. He's also been quoted or interviewed by the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, The Economist, Christian Science Monitor, The Financial Times, The Guardian, Associated Press, CBS, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, Reuters, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Radio Free Europe, interesting, Al Jazeera, Voice of America. His writings have been cited by decisions in the United States Supreme Court, multiple state Supreme Courts and lower federal courts, and the Supreme Court of Israel. He has testified on the use of drones for targeting and killing in the war on terror before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights. And in 2009, he testified on property right issues at the United States Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Oh, wow. Thank you for doing that. As a Latin person, thank you for doing that. Also writes for the Volkow Conspiracy. That's where I've read that. And he's the co-editor of the Supreme Court Economic Review, one of the country's top-rated law and economic journals. He's a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's also been visiting professor at Georgetown Law, University of Hamburg, University of Torquato di Tella in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Zhengzhou University in China. And before he joined the faculty at George Mason, he was also the John M. Olin Fellow at Law at Northwestern University Law School. He's also clerked for the Honorable Judge Jerry E. Smith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. That's a big circuit for everybody who's not as familiar. Amherst College, Harvard University, and Yale Law School. Exceptionally well educated. And this is the article where I found him. But before we get into that, let's check in and see how well I did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there something I need to correct?
I think you're mostly right. I'm actually no longer co-editor of the Supreme Court Economic Review. I left that position like 10 years ago, but I once was. And I think, did you mention my most recent book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom? I think
I did.
Great. And then other than those two small things, I think we should be set. Though I don't know if you really want to list quite as much of my bio as you did, but
yeah. Well, it's partly that the series is about my opinion doesn't matter. My goal is to talk to as many different people who've studied this seriously or experienced it, and so I read the bio to let people know.
Okay, we're talking. So obviously, it's your show. Feel free to read as much.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's partly to flatter the guests, and it's partly to let the watchers know we're talking to the source. We're talking to the people who are in the game. This isn't just Joe's feelings on political polarization or your aunt's or whatever. Okay, let's get right to it. We're going to be doing an interview with Professor Christopher F. Zurn Friday. He wrote a book called Splitsville, Democratic Argument for Breaking Up the United States. And Professor SOMIN wrote a book review for George Mason Legal Studies. Book review.
It's actually for Publius, the Journal of Federalism.
I'm sorry. It's for Publius, the Journal. There it is right there. Sorry. It says Publius, Journal of Federalism, forthcoming. Published December 8th, 2023. It's a book review, Splitsville, USA, Democratic Argument for Breaking Up the United States. You seem to say that and I have some select quotes here that, correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, this is an important topic. Yes, things are not great. Excuse me 1 second. Yes, things are not great, but and yes, it is a sign of the times that you have somebody of his academic pedigree looking into this issue. At the same time, his suggestion on splitting up America is not workable. Is that a fair summary? Okay topic, reasonable topic, not crazy to talk about it, but your solution isn't going to get us to the promised land.
Yeah, I think that's roughly right. I think at the very least, this is a more mainstream and reasonable topic than it used to be, which is certainly a sign of the times that is the case. But it's also the case that I'm highly skeptical that his proposal, is at all workable, and that if it was workable, that it would actually improve the situation as opposed to make things worse.
Yeah, one of the quotes that grabbed me was the fact that a book making this argument was written by a serious scholar and is getting respectful attention from other experts is a sign of the time. So polarization in America is getting worse, and we're getting higher level thinkers attracted to the field. I think some of your main arguments were it's easier to fix the problems than through a constitutional amendment. Zern is also too readily dismissive of less drastic remedies for our current ills. He argues that such approaches as restructuring the electoral system to reduce incentives for polarization, changing campaign finance rules, and devolving more power to state and local governments are either inadequate or impractical. He contends it's especially true of any reforms that require a constitutional amendment. What did you mean by there are less drastic remedies for our current ills than what he's suggesting?
So he seems to think that the only realistic methods are either when he suggests breaking up the country or ones that require a constitutional amendment. And I don't think that's true. We can, for instance, reduce conflict over the federal government and reduce political conflict generally by decentralizing more power to state and local governments and to the private sector. And that can be done without any constitutional amendments at all. They can be done partly by more rigorously enforcing the limits on government power and on federal power that we already have in our existing constitution, but haven't been sufficiently enforced. And it can also be done in part through ordinary legislation without any kind of constitutional amendment. And therefore, it can be done in ways that don't require the overwhelming supermajority that a constitutional amendment requires, where you have to have 2/3 of each House of Congress, and then 3/4 of states have to approve. There is another method by the Convention of the States, but that is also extraordinarily difficult. We don't have to do any of that to get more limitation and decentralization of government power. I think limitation and decentralization still is not easy. I don't think there are any simple, quick, and easy solutions to our problems, but it is easier than breaking up the country entirely, forming 2 or more new nations. That also faces enormous political obstacles, and if the political obstacles could be overcome, there would be a series of additional problems that would arise in actually trying to implement this, some of which I talk about in other parts of the review.
What are some of the lower thresholds for serious limitation of federal overreach and decentralization of federal power that don't require the gigantic threshold of 2/3, the constitutional amendment, or an Article 5 constitutional convention?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court and other federal courts could more rigorously enforce the limits on federal power that already exist in our present Constitution, but haven't always been effectively enforced. There's a long list of these things that we can talk about in more detail. They could also more rigorously enforce certain individual rights, both civil liberties, but also economic liberties and property rights and the like as well. On the legislative side, there is much that Congress can do to reduce federal spending and regulation and leave more of it to the state and local level or to the private sector. Indeed, the gargantuan fiscal crisis that we are facing in the next decade or so would likely require some measures of this kind, even aside from questions of polarization and over concentration of power. None of this is likely to be easy, but all of it is easier than either a constitutional amendment or breaking up the country entirely, which both is politically harder, and even if it could be done, it would create a number of additional serious problems, which I think Christopher Zurn has not, in some cases, sufficiently addressed in his book. So it's somewhat strange to argue, or at least unpersuasive to argue, that a drastic, radical remedy is better in part precisely because it's more feasible than things which are admittedly difficult, but do not require as much of a drastic destruction and reorientation of existing institutions. I'm not actually against at least some fairly radical policies. I'm libertarian after all, but I do recognize that the more radical the policy is, the harder, other things equal, it is to build a sort of political coalition for it and to make it happen.
And that was always something that grabbed me, was that libertarians had been talking for years about you can have any discussion and any level of decentralization, and people should be free to do that. And then I think it was Marjorie Taylor Greene, the sitting Congress member, said, well, we need to have a national divorce between red and blue on President's Day holiday. Got a lot of attention. But then you had, I think, Reason magazine, Libertarian magazine, if I'm not mistaken, come out and say, we don't need to have a discussion about splitting up America. That's not actual libertarianism, which seemed to be kind of an about face of what they had said for years.
So I don't think there has ever been anything like consensus or agreement with libertarians that secession or divorce, or want to call it, is desirable. What libertarians generally want is less involvement of government in people's lives. If breaking up the United States into multiple countries would achieve that, then it might be a good thing, but there's no guarantee that doing that will actually be the case. To take a dramatic example, the secession movement in American history that previously came closer to success was the Confederacy, which was obviously a distinctly non-libertarian movement, and that their whole purpose was to create a government that would be more hospitable to protecting and extending the institution of slavery, one of the most unlibertarian things that could possibly be imagined. There are situations where secession or breaking up of countries is good for libertarian values. That was true, for instance, of the breakup of the Soviet Union is a good example. But there can also be cases where the opposite is true. It depends on how libertarian the pre-existing central government is and what kinds of governments ruled in new nations that are created. It also depends on such things as whether there is freedom of movement between the newly formed countries or not, an issue that I note that Christopher Zurn doesn't sufficiently address in his proposals for breaking up the United States. He seems to just basically assume that there would be freedom of movement between the new countries, but there's no guarantee that that would actually be the case.
So you don't have to have full-on breakup. You don't have to have a constitutional amendment, which I've talked to many professors who said that's basically dead in America today. The last time we've done that so far ago, who knows if we could do that. But you're saying, hey, there's easier options, low-hanging fruit that are available. We don't have to go as radical. There is still things that the Supreme Court could do with changing the way that it does ruling, and Congress could do with changing the way that it handles spending. So if we had a more rigorous Supreme Court dedicated to these things, perhaps they could adjudicate a little differently. And if we had a Congress perhaps with a slightly different set of values, perhaps they could be more stringent on federal spending and more allowable.
And also on regulation as well as spending.
Regulation, yes. So is that what you mean? There's easier options.
Yeah. So I wouldn't characterize it as low-hanging fruit, or at least a lot of it is not low-hanging, but it is hanging lower than the really high-hanging fruit that Christopher Zurn would like us to try to pick. So we're talking about fruit that may be sort of in the middle of the tree, as opposed to fruit that is like at the very top of the tree, if it exists at all.
Okay, lower hanging fruit, not low-hanging fruit. So not super easy to get to, but easier than what he's saying.
Yes.
And so I wanted to ask you that, but I'll get back to that in a minute. So not all voters are for it. There are areas of people who would be isolated. This is one of the problems I think you pointed out. The problem would be exacerbated by the existence of strong dissenting minorities with the punitive new nations. For example, the state of Texas seeks to form a new, more conservative nation that would likely be resisted by the state's largely left liberal minority. What did you mean by this one?
Yeah.
There's
So
I've heard this
imagine that the
argument before.
U.S. Is broken up into red and blue nations, like Marjorie Taylor Greene was suggesting in that quote that you made. Although we talk about red and blue states, almost all of those states are not actually internally homogenous. For instance, the state of Texas is thought of as a red state, but in 2020, over 45% of Texas voters actually voted for Biden. And that includes the large majority of voters in several of the state's urban centers, Houston, Austin, Dallas, and so forth. If Texas were to form a new, more red, quote unquote, nation, or either by itself or with other red states, those dissenting blue minorities within Texas would be extremely unhappy about it. It might cause conflict. They might be subject to various kinds of oppression by their new central government and so on. And you can tell the same story about blue states trying to form a new blue nation. Even a state like California, which is sometimes seen as the quintessential blue state, it actually has a large red minority, particularly in its more rural areas. More than a third of Californians voted for Trump in the 2020 election. So how to deal with these new dissenting minorities would be a very difficult question. And Zern, I think, doesn't address it sufficiently. Among other things, he says, well, maybe those people could vote with their feet. I'm a big believer in foot voting. I've written a whole book about it, but it's not at all clear that the newly formed nations would, in fact, have free migration between them and would be open for foot voting. In addition, the dissenting minorities would be very large, and it would not be easy to accommodate them even with foot voting. Now, we do have some problems like that already, but at least the U.S. Constitution as it currently exists does impose some constraints, by no means perfect ones, but it does impose constraints on state and local level oppression of dissenting minorities. There's no guarantee that the same would be true of these new nations. So we would in effect within those nations be replicating some of the same problem that Zern says is the reason why we would want to have a breakup in the first place. And the problem could be worse because there wouldn't be a guarantee that the new nations would have constitutional protections for minorities. And there would be, in addition, the status of dissenting minorities in one new nation could be the subject of war, conflict with the other ones. Imagine that there's a red nation and a blue nation. The red nation might be angry about the conditions of the red minority in the blue nation and vice versa. There's a lot of historical examples like this where many of them dealing with ethno-states of various kinds. There is an ethnic minority of one nation in another, and the other country where that group is an ethnic majority. They use that. They become angry about it, or they attack, or they use it as a pretext for an attack. This is obviously something that Adolf Hitler did in the 1930s. Vladimir Putin has used this as a pretext for attacking Ukraine and so forth. And so this problem of dissenting minorities is one that is a very serious challenge given the enormous likely size of those minorities. And that is a severe challenge for any plan to break up the United States along red versus blue lines, or really along almost any other lines either.
So there's a desire to split us up because we're red and blue. But I think what you're saying is, okay, you split us up into red and blue, you're going to have chunks of red in the blue and chunks of blue in the red.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
What do? Split us up again? And then what do you do there? Split us up again and split us up again until we're completely atomized and totally segregated
Yeah.
communities?
So you could imagine splitting the US up into not 2 or 3 or 4 nations, but 40 or 50 or 100. And at some level, you might get greater homogeneity within each one. But then you would have, other kinds of problems we could talk about in more detail. Like it would be more difficult to have free trade and free migration. Defense would be a more serious problem with much smaller nations. There would be some types of public services that would be hard to provide at such a small scale. There might be other issues as well. So the size at which that problem is eliminated is a size that A, would be harder to get to in the first place politically, but B, if you did get to it, there would be other kinds of problems.
So you're trying to get rid of, oh, these people disagree with me, but there's going to be a minority of them left in your state. And what do you do with those people? And then we get into, are you guaranteeing the rights of all your political and ethnic minorities in your new state? And
yeah,
can we just assume they adopt all the same constitutional protections? It sounds like you're saying, no, we can't assume they'll do that.
We cannot assume it because I think in a situation where there's enough political support for something so drastic as breaking up the United States, we cannot assume that in that vastly changed political environment, that people would just unquestioningly accept existing constitutional constraints and would be willing to protect new minorities within the new countries, even if they still retain state constitutions. Most state constitutions are much easier to amend than the federal constitution, which in some respects is a good thing. But in other respects, if the fear is that the constitutional guarantees for minorities will be done away with, the fact that they're easy to amend, could be a problem in that regard, especially in a political environment where people are willing to engage in radical upheaval, and therefore these kinds of institutions won't necessarily be exempt. So I think a lot depends on the exact circumstances of the breakup and what kind of ideological or political movement is spearheading it and for what reason. But this issue of guaranteeing minority rights will be a very serious one. It has been in previous secessions and breakups, previous nationalist movements, and like elsewhere around the world. And we will be kidding ourselves if we think that wouldn't happen. That couldn't happen here if the United States were to break up.
So things get so dramatic. You're like, people are saying, let's break up. At that point where you're emotionally, intellectually ready to do something so drastic, we can't assume that you would be rational to say, I want to make sure all those American constitutional rights are enshrined in the new nation and locked down so that it can't be changed. That you're already thinking so radically that we can't assume you're going to focus on the nuts and bolts and tiny details to make sure everybody gets the same amount of rights that they were used to under a pre-existing government.
Yeah, we cannot assume that. A lot will depend on the exact circumstance in which this thing happens, if it does happen. And there is a long history of the formation of new nations leading to persecution of various kinds of minorities and the like. That doesn't mean that formation is never justified, but this is a cost that has to be considered. It happened even with the American Revolution, where the new state governments did oppress the substantial loyalist minority that wanted to remain loyal to Great Britain. I think overall you can say it was worth it because enough good was done to offset this evil, but that evil was a genuine evil, and it did happen even in spite of the fact that the new revolution was motivated by the protection of rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so for a lot of state governments basically said, we don't think that really applies to loyalists, or at least it doesn't apply enough to prevent us from doing things like confiscating all their property.
And that's where it comes back to, you have these cores. So in California, the top fifth is dominated by Trump voters. It's been that way since the entire time. In Texas, you kind of have an urban core around Austin, Houston, Dallas, the three metro areas that it's blue. And I think what you're pointing out is we could end up with a situation like during the American Revolutionary War, where you have these pockets of loyalists behind and they're connected to it. Yeah. Also, the Iraq War. America went into Iraq, sided with the Shia, and the Sunni were getting decimated. And then a country called Saudi Arabia called the vice president of America, Dick Cheney, to the kingdom and said, you're going to start dealing with the Sunnis different, because although we're a separate country, we're ethnic Sunnis. or we, Saudi Arabia, will get directly involved in your war. And within 2 weeks, Dick Cheney had America operating very differently on the ground within the Sunni area. I believe it was Anbar province. Okay, moving on. Minorities left behind. I think we talked about that. The breakup of the United States would also certainly increase the relative power of expansionist authoritarian states, particularly China and Russia. China would likely become the most powerful nation in the world. That would, at least in the short term, medium term, probably lead to more illiberal and violent international systems. So America breaks up, China and Russia automatically become dominant superpowers.
In the case of China, that would surely be true. China is already the second most powerful nation in the world. If the US, the most powerful, were to break up, China, at least in the short to medium term, would be the most powerful. And that would have a big and I think negative impact on the international system. Russia also, though it would not be the most powerful nation, would be much freer to act if the US were to break up. And this is what makes breaking up the US, this is one of the things that makes breaking up the US different from, say, breaking up a smaller, less significant power like Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia or some other examples we could name. This would have a big and I think largely negative impact on the international system as a whole, because it would strengthen the relatively authoritarian and expansionist powers in the world. And while the U.S. foreign policy has its problems, and we certainly haven't always acted wisely or justly, a world in which the United States is the most powerful nation is overall, for what should be fairly obvious reasons, is far preferable to one where China is the most powerful nation, aided by an expansionist and authoritarian Russia. And this issue, I think, is almost completely ignored in Christopher Zern's book, that the breakup of the US would have a significant negative effect, not just potentially on Americans, but on the world as a whole. And maybe you could try to make arguments it wouldn't be so bad. You could say maybe Western European democracies would rise to the occasion. Maybe there would be some other ways of mitigating the problem, but at the very least, that would need to be given careful thought. And in the short to medium run, I do not see a replacement for the U.S. as the bulwark of liberal democracy in the world. The European Union, for a variety of reasons, I think is not up to the task, and liberal democratic powers elsewhere, Japan, Korea, and so forth, I think just aren't large and powerful enough to do it without U.S. support. And that's a very significant negative effect of breaking up the U.S. It would take a lot to outweigh it. And I don't see Zern and others who want to do it as having even come close to proving that there would be positives large enough to outweigh just even this international effect by itself. And on top of that, obviously, there could be negative domestic effects within the former U.S. as well.
America holds up the international rules-based order that it built roughly after World War II. They're the principal person holding it, I think, with 1 to 200 military bases beyond the British Empire everywhere. If that was removed, I think what you're talking about is a power vacuum. And that now we don't necessarily need to hold on to this international rules-based order. I'm China, I'm Russia, I'm big, I'll just do what I want. I don't really care about international law. Is that roughly the concern?
So that's part of it, but it's not just specific rules of international law. It is the dominant power in the world, the largest power in the world, pushing, at least roughly speaking, in favor of liberal democracy and relatively free markets and liberal institutions, or is it an authoritarian nationalist state? Mm-hmm. That makes a huge difference, not just on specific rules of international law and the like, but on a vast range of things, including what kinds of regimes are likely to come to power, the levels of respect for human rights, and many, many, many other things. I think there is little doubt for anybody who values liberal democracy that a world order where the U.S. is the most powerful nation is far preferable to one where China, supported by Russia, is the most powerful nation. And I think you can reach that conclusion even if you don't think, and I certainly don't think, that U.S. foreign policy has always made the right decisions, or that everything the U.S. government does is good. The relevant test is not comparing the U.S. to the ideal dominant power, but comparing the U.S. to the available alternatives, which is China backed by Russia.
What if the international rules-based order, the system of fair play, the upholding democracy, that image that America is trying to do that falls on its own. And basically, no one in the world believes that about America anymore. Could we still say that America's holding that up, and that if America's gone, that light's gone, when most of the world doesn't believe America holds those values anymore?
Yeah. So things can be true independent of whether people believe in them or not. For most of world history, most people believed the earth was flat, but that doesn't mean it wasn't round during that time. Similarly, even if most people believe, which by the way, surveys show they do not actually believe this, but even if most people around the world believe that a world order with China as the most powerful nation would be as good or better than one with the US as the most powerful nation, even if most people believe that, they could be wrong about that belief. And in fact, I think they would be wrong about that belief. But in fact, if you look at even over the last couple of years, surveys of opinion around the world, the U.S. does in fact, in most of the world, have a more positive image than China and Russia, and more people want a world order where the U.S. is the most powerful state than want China and Russia. Which is not to say that everybody loves the U.S. or that they like every decision that the U.S. government makes. They obviously don't, but they nonetheless like the U.S. more or dislike it less than they dislike China and Russia.
That could be true. I remember
If you
when
look at
Russia.
surveys by Pew and other polling
Oh,
firms,
certainly. But if we're going to talk,
which do surveys across the world of people's opinions of different governments and countries, and the U.S. certainly doesn't have a universally positive image by any means, but it's much more positive than that of China and Russia. But even if that weren't true, public opinion can be wrong about many things. And if the general public around the world did prefer, a Chinese-led world order, that would just be one of many things the public opinion is wrong about.
I'm not saying that they may prefer a public order. I'm saying, what if America loses so much credibility that no one on earth believes that we need America to uphold democracy or rules-based order or anything? They're not picking Russia and China, but they're saying, America, you guys say you're about this, and then you do the opposite thing so many times. 95% of the global population, the global South, just doesn't believe you're about it anymore. So we're not afraid about losing it because we don't think you're really about it. What if that happens? We've seen a lot of moves recently in the international sports.
So we're talking about a hypothetical here, because the actual distribution of opinion in the world is not like this, according to lots of survey evidence that is out there, especially when you do compare the U.S. not to an ideal, but to the alternatives, which is the relevant comparison. But again, even if people around the world had deeply wrong beliefs about the relative merits of a U.S.-led world order compared to a Chinese-led one, that wouldn't change the truth. It would just make the truth, somewhat harder to stick to or follow. But the fact that the majority of people in the world are wrong about something, doesn't make it less true.
Fair enough. I'm just pointing out that you have BRICS coming together in a higher order than ever before, more nations joining it. They have now more purchasing power parity than the entire Western order bloc together, especially after Saudi Arabia joined. Additionally, we can look at the UN vote. I'm not getting into the subject. Okay, so don't text me or email me after. I'm simply bringing up a fact. There was a vote to have a ceasefire in Gaza Strip. It was basically America was the only vote against that, and the entire rest of the planet was for it. That's bad.
So it's not actually factually true that the entire rest of the planet was for it. About 30 some odd nations either voted no or abstained on the vote. But it's true the U.S. has long been isolated in the UN over Israel-related issues. We can talk about that at some other time. Sure. But that is just one of many issues in the world. If you look at the issue of Ukraine, you see the opposite pattern. The U.S. did much better than its enemies in that UN vote. But I think the key point here is when you actually look at public opinion around the world, and there's a lot of data on this, the U.S. is viewed more favorably than its principal rivals. That doesn't mean that other countries in the world agree with the U.S. on everything, and it doesn't preclude the existence of some issues where the U.S. is in a small minority.
I hear you, but we also have the vote in Russia and Ukraine, and it was famous where you had Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, saying the world's with us, and then 3/4 of the world body voted no on that resolution. And we go back to the Gaza one. Yes, some countries abstained, but it was like America alone. I mean, our European allies are going up and down about this. These aren't considered good looks by the world order, and they happen back and forth. I mean, is it possible that at some point, whether it's right or wrong, whether people are dumb or not, the image of America just gets so bad, no one's really buying it?
So anything is possible, but it would take a lot for a world order to show that a world order led by China with the most powerful nation backed by Russia would be better than the U.S. world order, led world order. Again, I reemphasize the point that we have to compare this not to an ideal world order, but to the relevantly available alternatives, and the relevantly available alternative is far worse. And I would also note that the Israel issue for many years has been exceptional, and that the U.S. tends to get outvoted on that at the UN. Ultimately, Israel and the Palestinian territories are one small corner of the world. There's many far bigger issues out there, and therefore, this is a little bit like saying that there can be a politician or a country that is generally popular, but they have this one really unpopular stance, and you can't judge their overall level of popularity by their single least popular issue on the international stage. Israel is that for the U.S. I think, by the way, we're actually generally right to back Israel against the various Palestinian terrorists, even though I'm not a fan of the Israeli government. But even if you disagree with me on that, again, this issue is an outlier compared to a variety of others, and including compared to many other issues that have vastly bigger effects on the vast majority of the people in the world who are neither Palestinians nor Israelis.
I didn't want to, again, I said, I prefaced it. I didn't want to get into it. I'm just saying, I've watched international issues. I've been a fan of the UN. I'm not familiar with seeing the Secretary of State of America get up on TV and say the world's with us, and then they have a UN vote and 3/4 of the countries don't.
So if you look at all the actual votes that happen on Ukraine, actually the overwhelmingly, the UN General Assembly has voted to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to endorse the idea that Russia must withdraw its forces and so forth. Now, I'm not saying that the fact that the UN General Assembly voted that way proves that it's right. I think I have a very low opinion of the UN General Assembly, most of which consists of various corrupt dictatorships and the like. But on that issue and on quite a few others, and in terms of the actual polls of actual people as opposed to authoritarian governments, the US is much more popular in most places in the world than its leading adversaries. You can look at the Pew data on this. You can look at other surveys of world opinion. They tend to reach the same conclusions. As I noted earlier, that doesn't mean all U.S. stances are popular or that everything the U.S. does is right. It just means that the U.S. is significantly more popular than its main opponents, or less unpopular, if you want to put it that way.
Okay. I was just curious that where things go in the future. I've never seen that level of instability or blowback. What other concerns are there with Splitsville that he's missing? So he's not worried about the minorities that are left behind. He's not worried about how you can constantly have division, and he's not worried about external enemies.
Yeah. So in fairness, he does talk a little bit about the minorities left behind. I just think his treatment is inadequate. He does not consider the international effects on the world as a whole. I think those are the biggest issues. I think also, as we mentioned before, he's too dismissive of sort of less drastic remedies for problems such as most notably decentralizing and limiting government power, but also even such things as reforming the electoral system, which I think is even more difficult to do than decentralization and limitation, but it may be less difficult to do than breaking up the U.S. So at least relative to his preferred solution, he's too dismissive of that one as well. So those are my principal objections. I think we've mainly covered them. There are probably smaller points in particular parts of the book which I might also quarrel with. But I think the big picture ones are: one, the international impact; second, the issue of dissenting minorities; and third, that the political feasibility of his project which ironically, in his view, actually is one of the things that recommends it. The political feasibility of his proposal is actually less than that of some of the ones that he dismisses, in part for what he regards as their insufficient feasibility. Those are my main concerns about his proposal, and also, others like it, whether they be Marjorie Taylor Greene breaking up the red and blue states, or others.
I had
Obviously,
to mention it. I'm
she
sorry.
is not as serious a thinker as he is, and I think she hasn't thought her idea through as much. But if you have a simple model of the red states and the blue states forming a country, which some people do, or forming two different countries, some people do have that idea in their heads, all the same problems would arise. In addition, would be the issue that the countries wouldn't necessarily be very contiguous, and that would be an additional problem.
I apologize for bringing her up. I know she's a controversial figure. Unfortunately, she started kind of a national conversation, right or wrong.
Sure.
So she's there. This is from the Pew survey. It brings up what you were saying. Key allies still believe U.S. is a reliable partner for the country. Canada, Netherlands, Malaysia, South Korea. And this is from 2022 from Pew survey, totally backing up what you're saying. I would just point out, it seems like America's image has tarnished over time internationally, certainly since the Iraq War. Kind of took a hit.
So I think if you look at data on this, it goes down when something like the Iraq War happens, but it's actually crept up at various points since then. And if you look at not just surveys of U.S. allies, but surveys of places like Africa, South America, and elsewhere, most countries in Asia, if you ask questions like, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the United States, China, Russia, whatever, U.S. in the vast majority of nations scores higher, including the vast majority of global South nations. Like all surveys, these surveys are imperfect, and they don't capture all the nuances of people's opinions, but the differences are large and striking nonetheless.
Yeah, there's another Pew survey where they said the same thing. Overall opinion of the U.S. is positive. 59% have a favorable view of the U.S., and that's from 2023, according to Pew. So,
and when you do China's and Russia's numbers, on the whole, they are worse. With rare exceptions.
Global view of China.
Yeah, if you find similar Pew and other surveys on them, you will find that that their favorability is lower. That doesn't.
We have that. So Pew did that, and it's at 82% unfavorable for China.
Yeah. So that's a higher number than I remember, but my memory must be off. Again, if you compare the U.S. to perfection, or whatever people regard as perfection, the U.S. will score low compared to that. I totally agree. But compared to the alternatives, it's notable. I would note also this, as I've said in some of my writings, I write about, as you may know, about voting with your feet. There's many more people that want to vote with your feet for the U.S. and its close allies than want to move to China, or especially Russia. Indeed, Russia and this is itself experiencing a large out-migration that we could encourage more of. I've written about this in some of my other work. So the evidence of people voting with their feet is also relevant here, in that people think more carefully about when they vote with their feet than when they vote at the ballot box, or when they respond to a survey and the like. So the U.S. isn't perfect. It has many flaws. You and I, I'm sure, spend so much of our time talking and writing about them. But if you compare it to the alternatives, it's pretty good. And that also is a point that I make in my article. Like, I'm not against all secession or all breakup of existing nations. I'm a libertarian, as mentioned earlier. I'm not wedded to existing governments for their own sake. But when you have an existing government that, compared to others in the world, is overall pretty good, that doesn't mean that we could never improve it by breaking it up. But the threshold of evidence that you need to establish to justify a breakup is higher than in a case like the Soviet Union, which was horrendous, or a case like Yugoslavia, which was not as bad as the Soviet Union, but still, not great, or some of the other cases we're talking about. Similarly, maybe you could justify a breakup if there was overwhelming support for it. Like, I think Czechoslovakia was not that bad, but there was overwhelming support for a breakup in both the what became the Czech Republic and in Slovakia. So, it was reasonable to do it. If we had that kind of overwhelming consensus in the United States, then maybe, it would be a good idea here too. But because of the dissenting minority issue that we talked about, it is unlikely that we could get to that kind of overwhelming consensus. As we mentioned, people in Dallas and Houston would not be happy if Texas became an independent red state or part of an independent red nation, and ditto for the conservatives in the California hinterland if California were to become a blue nation and so forth. So it is not my view that breaking up the United States could never be justified under any conceivable circumstances.
Sure.
I'm a libertarian. I'm willing to consider radical ideas.
Sure.
I love science fiction and fantasy, so I'm willing to consider all sorts of weird scenarios. But when we're talking about actually implementing them in the real world, I want to see the proof, that it's actually necessary and it will actually make things better. My threshold for that is higher than my threshold for, having a bull session about a science fiction or alternate history or whatnot. I do have to go in a few minutes, though I totally recognize that this raises many issues, both international and domestic. We can't do full justice to them here. And I admit I don't do full justice to all the possible issues in my 7 or 8 page review of the book. I think the book itself also doesn't do full justice to them, which is part of my critique of some of these arguments. But I think the bottom line is that there's 3 or 4 very significant problems with the proposal. And I think so far, he and others have not done anywhere near enough to show that the proposal could overcome those problems. I do admit, as I mentioned in the review, that if you imagine a world where like the existing federal government of the U.S. becomes vastly worse than it currently is, then at some point you could say, well, even great risks are justifiable if the alternative is much worse. There are some governments that are so horrible, North Korea, for example, where you say,
yes, of course.
If I have a replacement government for North Korea, it doesn't have to be all that good or even good at all to be better than the status quo. The U.S. is a higher threshold than that.
There is a movie called Civil War coming out this year with Kirsten Dunst, where the scenario is a 5th-term American president who can't be unseated. And a independent Texas and California worked together. I didn't make the story up to fight the federal government.
So they made it up. I've heard that part of the plot. That seems implausible to me. But yes, you can imagine a situation where the U.S. breaks down into dictatorship, and Zern actually does imagine this to some degree. If you think this is going to happen in the near future, though, it would be difficult to come up with a politically feasible breakup that could happen sooner than that. Yeah, and if you think it's only going to happen in the medium to long-term future, then these other less drastic solutions are ones that can also be given time to work and would be less difficult to implement than breakup to preempt something that would only happen 20 or 30 years from now or something like that.
I get what you're saying. The thing that grabs me is a conclusion you've already made, which is we're at a time now where smart people are talking about this, even if they're wrong, even if they got some of their facts right. You're reviewing this. I've watched the secession article since CalExit in 2016. They didn't necessarily have a professor write a book for secession and then another outstanding professor criticize that in detail. We're getting to a super level of detailed conversations amongst top level thinkers I didn't see in the past couple of years. Is that a good sign for the stability of America, or does it suggest that perhaps we might have a tough road ahead?
It's probably not a good sign, in the sense that obviously the reason why we're having this discussion and the reason why Publius asked me to review this book, it's not because Publius thinks I'm wonderful. It's because Publius, which is a leading academic journal, thinks this issue, the editors think this issue is more important now than it would have been 10 or 20 years ago. That said, there is a long distance between academics discussing something seriously and it actually being implemented. This is less of an ivory tower kind of issue than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Thank you.
But it's not nearly as much as practical and immediately likely as it was, say, during the 1850s, when obviously we did have a secession movement that actually culminated in civil war. So we are closer to that than we were 10 years ago. But my hope and expectation is that we're still not nearly as close to it as we were in, say, 1855 or 1860 or whatever. And as I also note to review, the U.S. has overcome with more severe crises than the one we face now. The Great Depression, World War II, the upheavals in the 1960s, and so on. We shouldn't count it out, at least not yet.
Last two questions, personal one. I've done about interviews with 200 professors on political polarization, and I'm starting to put together some results. Do you have any contacts? Is there anyone be a good person to contact at Cato? I know Cato does a lot of publications.
On political polarization.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure there's really someone at Cato that really writes extensively about that, but you might want to talk to Alex Navrastek at Cato, who he writes a lot about sort of immigration and institutions, but some of his work is relevant to this. And he and I have an article in National Affairs coming out in a couple of weeks, which criticizes nationalism, not quite directly relevant to our current discussion, but nationalism is a leading alternative, at least on the political right, to sort of liberalism and liberal democracy. So Alex might have some interesting thoughts for you. He's not a professor, obviously, but he is a think tank scholar, and he has published works in leading academic journals and also a book with Cambridge University Press and the like. So if you're looking at somebody at Cato, he would be, I think, the person with the most relevant things to say.
What was his last name? Nebraska?
No, Navrastek. Nowratesh. If you have trouble finding it, just email me and I'll send you his name.
Thank you so much. Last thing, you don't have to name anybody, but we always try to keep the conversation going. Is there anybody that you would feel might be comfortable having a conversation on political polarization? They could be an academic, a non-academic, an activist, anybody you know who might be an open conversation. I hope you found that this was a fair interview.
So no, I think it was fair. You asked entirely reasonable questions. I don't always agree with all the premises of the questions, but that's fine. People who agree with each other on everything, it's a less interesting discussion if people don't.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you're asking me, like, is there somebody that I should have a discussion with, or somebody you should
No. Do you have any names that I could reach out to who you think might be open to discussing political polarization or the level?
So I already mentioned Alex Navrastek. I think might be good in some relevant issues. There is a vast literature on polarization. Is trying to think of people I saw your list from before. You have a pretty extensive list of experts that you've talked to. I think I'm blanking out on the
sorry.
I'm blanking out on the name, but as I get older, my memory is not as good as it used to be.
I put you up on the spot.
Can you email me later and I'll give you his name at that point?
I will.
But he's actually discussed in Zern's book. He's the guy who wants to switch the U.S. to a more proportional representation kind of system.
Oh.
He's written a book called "Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop."
That.
I am a bit more skeptical of his proposal than obviously he is himself, but I do think it's more plausible than Zern's proposal.
Last question, super mega quick. Thank you for being here. You're not you, you're not me. Somebody's watching this video. They're going, wow, I learned a lot, but I'm struggling to remember it all. So much great information. Hadn't heard the perspectives. Really insightful. There was this one thing, though, that the professor said. It's 5 days after I finished watching that interview, and I can't get this one thought the professor said out of my head. What is that one thought, Professor?
When it comes to breaking up the U.S., I think the one big thought is that the U.S., compared to most other nations now and historically, is actually pretty good. Therefore, that raises the threshold approved for showing that whatever new nations you replace it with would actually be better. It's easy to come up with something that would clearly be better in North Korea or quite a lot of other examples come up with around the world. With the U.S., the threshold is higher. Doesn't mean it can never be met, but it does mean you have to make the effort and you have a pretty high burden of proof. I'd also note in the little break there, I looked up the name of that person. His name is Lee Drutman.
Lee Drutman. Thank you. Yes.
If you like, you can tell him I suggested that you talk to him, and I don't fully agree with his perspective, but I think he does have interesting ideas for how we can have a less polarizing electoral system within, without a constitutional amendment. Along similar lines, my friend and former colleague Max Stearns, who's at the University of Maryland, STARNS, he has a book that's coming out in the next couple of weeks about switching to a more proportional representation, more parliamentary system of government. I don't fully agree with Max either. And I think his proposals are actually a bit less feasible than Lee Drutman's even, but they're still probably more feasible than breaking up the US. So Max is another person that you may wish to talk to.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, I will definitely reach out to Max and Lee Drutman. We'll leave it there. I will send you a copy of the video. I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for answering all the questions.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I did not mean to be annoyed with you before
No.
discussing international stuff. I think this issue of Israel and Palestine and so forth is the most issue for a lot of people, even for people like me, where it's not that I love the Israeli government. They do. I think Bibi Netanyahu is awful, but I also think Israel is clearly less bad than its adversaries, which obviously you and others may disagree with. That's fine, but because this issue is on people's minds all the time recently, it becomes it's a tail that tends to wag other bigger dogs.
Fair enough. Fair. My concern was that I'm not used to saying, "Hey, let's stop bombing," and it basically, I understand some details, basically looks like America was the only country in the world to say no. And I'm not used to this.
There's actually a long history of the U.S. being part of a small minority in the UN on anti-Israel resolutions there. That's been going on for decades. And this is just the latest iteration of that. And we could have a whole other discussion on this particular issue, but that's probably for a podcast, for another podcast. But it is similar to how a politician or a party that's relatively popular overall can still have, one or two issues where they hold stances that are highly unpopular. There are many examples of this in history. Richard Nixon won re-election with 63% of the vote, but he did hold some unpopular positions, right?
Sure.
If you go back in history, you can find positions that he had that most voters really didn't like.
Oh yeah, and Reagan too.
And there's and I myself don't like Nixon. I'm just giving him as an and same thing with FDR, who won overwhelming re-election and so on. But he did hold some some views on some issues that were unpopular, and the U.S. for various historical reasons holds a position on the Arab-Israeli conflict that most of the rest of the international community either doesn't like or has reasons for pretending that they don't like. You can have an argument about whether it would be better for the U.S. or for the world as a whole to not have that position. And that's a discussion certainly you could have either with me or with somebody else, probably at a different time.
That would be awesome. I was more concerned that came right after. I'm not getting it right, but there was a vote in the UN. There was a couple, and there was one where they got Russia, but there was another vote to do something to Russia, and they couldn't get 3/4 of the global South to back that.
So I would have to look to see exactly what that vote was. Okay. But on votes to condemn the Russian invasion and to require Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine, the votes on that were overwhelming. They were generally assembly votes that have no binding significance. In the Security Council, Russia was able to veto this stuff, and by the way, they were the only veto. Even China abstained in those resolutions rather than vetoing them. But I also think I think the UN General Assembly is an awful institution. So what they say, so even when they take votes that I agree with, I don't go and say, well, because the General Assembly voted, that must mean that my position is true. But nonetheless, there were pretty lopsided votes on those issues. I have to go.
Fair enough. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming and talking with me.
I have actually written about Russia-Ukraine stuff quite a bit. If you Google, you can see what I think if you care. Just Google my name and Ukraine. That is an example where most world opinion did condemn what Russia did. It's just that Russia was Russia was willing to thumb its nose at most of world opinion on that issue. They think they will outlast us, and we'll see if they're right or not.
I'm not drawing the reference, but there was a vote, and it was right after Blinken said the world's with us, and it was directly opposite that. And I was concerned that I've never seen that in U.S. history.
So I would have to see exactly what they were voting on. Nonetheless, they're sort of on the big issues of the Russia-Ukraine war. There were pretty lopsided votes against Russia and in favor of the U.S. position. Those votes perhaps didn't do much good, and that they didn't have much effect in actually getting Russia to withdraw, but they did happen.
Yeah, it's just I'm not familiar with saying that, and it seems scary to me. That's all. That's all I was trying to say.
Fair enough. I got to go in a minute, but I thank you for interviewing. I look forward to seeing it.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for coming out.